You know what's great? Pikmin 4. There's Min, and you pick them, and also 4. What more could you possibly want out of a game 10 years in the making? In all seriousness, this is a sequel to my last video talking about the Pikmin series biology, a video that has done...
Who are you people?
So yeah, that's nifty. Today, we're revisiting the topic to not only discuss the new slate of freaks and weirdos that Pikmin 4 introduced, but also some other odds and ends that I never mentioned in the first video, and even a few alterations that I made to the stuff from the first video. And boy, are there a lot of extra thingies to talk about. Before we jump in though, I will add that there are going to be comprehensive spoilers for basically all of Pikmin 4 in this video, ranging from the final boss to a couple of special little post-game unlockables. So if you don't want to be spoiled, go out, buy the game, 100% it twice more to fill in all 3 save slots, then return and enjoy. So with that said, now let's hop into it. To begin, let's look at all the families that we talked about in the last video and see how Pikmin 4 expanded upon them. To start, there's the Grub Dogs. Here is the upgraded cladogram I made for the Grub Dogs relationship. Firstly, a brand new Bulborb species was introduced, the Frosty Bulborbs. I wedged these guys in between the Whiptongue and Kageyami Bulborbs, as they more closely resemble the latter, particularly the mouth structure. Then there's the Jumbo Bulborb and Sovereign Bulblax. The former is of the same species as the regular Bulborb, just suffering a chromosomal abnormality that made it massive. The latter is just an elderly Emperor Bulblax, who acts as they did in Pikmin 1, which serves as a neat way to canonize the 2 different Emperor Bulblax fights from the series. Then, most notably, we have Empress Bulblax, the larva, and the albino Dwarf Bulborb. Empress has been reclassified as a subspecies of the Kageyami Bulborbs, and both the larva and albinos are larval forms of the Kageyami Bulborbs as well. As such, I included larva and albinos with the red, orange, and hairy Bulborbs as extra life stages. As for Empress, given her new classification and giving birth to larva, I opted to group her with the red Bulborbs in the Russus subspecies, possibly as an additional life stage. I could also hypothesize that this could mean that an orange or hairy Bulborb could grow into their own version of Empress who gives birth to their species. But of course that last bit is just pure mad speculation. Now, technically speaking, the bread bugs could come next, but nothing was added for them, so we'll move straight to the Mandiblards. Not that they did much better, of course, outside the returning Sheargrubs and Wigs, we got the Mama Sheargrub, who is the same species as the female Sheargrub, just grown gigantic and retaining their juvenile appearance. So, here it is. Next up on the list are the Dweevils, which actually do have a few new members and interesting interests. Firstly, I took the liberty of pulling apart my original cladogram and reworking how the elemental Dweevils evolved. Firstly, we have the Caustic Dweevil, aka the Hydro Dweevil, who I still believe is the least evolved, as its defense is nothing more than bodily fluids. Next is the all-new Ice-Blown Dweevil, which attacks using freezing cold gas, which I think could have been a potential evolution of their fluid attacks. Next are the Fiery Dweevils, which attack with flammable gas. Then the Munge and Venom Dweevils, attacking with 2 gases mixed into poisonous fumes. And finally, there's the Anode Dweevil, which has grown a specialized organ to emit electrical charges, which is likely the most evolved of the lot. Then there's the matter of the Munge and Venom Dweevils. Despite sharing basically the exact same Piclopedia description, these 2 creatures have differing common and scientific names, in both Pikmin 2 on GameCube, Pikmin 2 on Switch, and Pikmin 4. As such, I'm not entirely sure we should count the Venom Dweevil as just a replacement of the Munge Dweevil and being basically the same thing, or just a completely different species. I opted for the latter just for the purpose of completion, but I can see the value in going either way with this bizarre case. Next up are the Blowhogs, which also got some decent newbies. Firstly, on the aerial side is the Icy Blowhog, which has a closer visual resemblance to the Puffy Boy rather than the Withering Boy. On the grounded side, first is the Tusk Blowhog, which is of course the most different from the lot. Now, technically, this thing belongs to the Tusk Blowhog family, which is a completely unique family to the Blowhogs. However, I thought that this was rather lame, and also they have the same genus as the rest of the hogs, sus, which isn't allowed for creatures of different families in real-world biology. So yeah, here you go, buddy. Next up is the Snowy Blowhog, which gets its own branch underneath the Fiery Blowhog, as I feel its ability to create frigid cold air is less complex than the Fire Blowhog's fire-breathing abilities. Finally, there's the Titan and Blizzarding Blowhogs, which are the same species as Fiery and Snowy Blowhogs, just grown to giant size. The Titan is big because of a hormonal abnormality, and the Blizzarding is big because of an endocrine abnormality. Are those the same thing? I'm not gonna look it up and just call them the same thing, Lamau. The Amphitubers come next, with them receiving 2 new members. First is the Chili Hop, which visually resembles the Yellow Wally Hop, but it is part of a different species. As such, it and the fiery young Yellow Hop are separate. The other is the Master Hop, the same species as the normal yellow hops, who's grown to a large size with age, much like the Sovereign Bulblax. Now for one of my favorite families again, the Arachnorbs. Pikmin 4 saw the appearance of 3 Arachnorbs, the returning Baldy Longlegs and Man-At-Legs, and the all-new Groovy Longlegs. Groovy's attack patterns fall much more in line with the Baldy type of Arachnorbs, but he's also radically different, with a largely inorganic exterior, possibly made of plastic or metals, hallucinogenic gases, and stomping in time to his boss theme, which may have been playing from the amplified amplifier that he's carrying inside of him. For these reasons, I gave him his own branch separate from the other crushing Arachnorbs. I also found it an interesting thought how both Groovy and Man-At-Legs are made of both organic and inorganic material, so maybe there's some bigger connection there? I don't know why balls with 4 legs are so cool, but they are, don't at me. Next is an interesting one, the Lithopods. Firstly, the Arctic Cannon larva returns, alongside its all-new fully grown form, the Arctic Cannon Beetle. Obviously, both share the same species, so there we go. More interestingly, though, is the Armored Cannon Larva and Horned Cannon Beetle. Yeah, so I was actually wrong last time. This isn't an Armored Cannon Beetle. It's actually a totally unique species. I think. See, the thing is, it looks basically the same as the Armored Beetle from 1, and it's unclear exactly how much of its different appearance is due to it being a different species, or just because of the graphical update from GameCube to Switch. However, its behavior is exactly the same as the Pikmin 1 Beetle, it's been grouped with other returning enemies in promo art, and Olimar describes it as a migratory species, very much like Pikmin 1, that's been mistaken for Armored Cannon Beetles. So yeah, it's very likely that these 2 creatures are in fact the same being, rather than a fully grown Armored Cannon larva. All that said, the Horned Cannon Beetle is stuck right next to the armored ones, and I'm keeping the quote-unquote adult Armored Cannon Beetle from Pikmin 1 with the larva just for the sake of it, at least until it's fully confirmed that they are different and we get to see a real adult. Now this more or less covers the biggest new additions in the game, but there's a couple more odds and ends to mention. Firstly, there's the Molluskings, which have a new creature, the Bloom-capped Bloister. Olimar's notes state this is actually the species from which the other Bloisters evolved from, which is especially fascinating. Fittingly, I gave it a unique branch separate from the other 2 Bloisters. Next are the Snavians, which gain the Downy Snagret. This enemy is a juvenile burrowing Snagret, so of course it goes in the same branch. We also still haven't seen the Snarrow. Now for an interesting case, the Flutterbees. In Pikmin 3, the red Spectralid was named as part of the Fenestrati genus, while the others were in the Fenestari genus. In Pikmin 4, it was renamed to the Fenestari genus, likely meaning that the Pikmin 3 classification was a mistake. Regardless, I've reorganized it accordingly, grouping it with the other Pic 3 Spectralids, but in its own branch due to its rarity in Pikmin 3 and complex process of creating ultra-spicy nectar. Now there's the Flint Beetle family, of which I've added the Glint Beetle. I decide if I'm grouping the Tusk Blowhog with the other hogs, it's only fair that I do the same thing here. I find it makes sense regardless, given it acts exactly the same as the normal Flints, just a bit more, jittery. So that covers all the families we talked about last time with at least 1 member. While there are a number of other families that did return, such as the breadbugs, the scarpinids, and the scarab beetles, they didn't get any new members, and were thus really just useful to provide some fancy new 3D models for the thing. So now let's start talking about some new stuff. To begin, there's the Spitter Spatter family, which had only one member and thus didn't get its own cladogram. However, Pikmin 4 brought back said member, the Skeeter Skate, and introduced a new variant of the same genus, the Mucker Skate. Pretty simple, all things considered. Next is the only family introduced in Pikmin 4 with multiple members, the Shellcake family. All three belong to the Conch Crustus genus, and I chose to separate the Shock Cake from the Scorch and Freeze cakes, as its ability to generate electricity sounds much more complex and highly evolved than the other abilities to generate fire and ice. Then there's the Chrysanthemum family, making a return from Pikmin 2. Both the Creeping Chrysanthemum and the newly introduced Startle Spore belong to the same genus, and are appropriately split apart. Some side notes, I included both the original and new looks for the Creeping Chrysanthemum, largely for completion's sake, and in both Pikmin 2 and 4, members are said to come from the Taraxacum genus. However, this genus is also used by dandelions in Pikmin 2, as they are in the real world. And while dandelions aren't being featured here, I still felt the need to rename their genus to something wholly original, the Pseudoflora genus. Bask in the cleverality of that name. Next, we're gonna stick to the plant people with the long-awaited Pelletweed, Candy Pop, and Pikmin families. Firstly, the Pelletweed is the most simple and basic. We got both the Pellet Posty and Burgeoning Spiderwort in two separate genera, which was honestly really cool and surprising. Apparently, both are somehow someway related and dependent on fungi growing on their roots. Neat. More interestingly are the Candy Pop family, consisting of the Candy Pops and the Onions. Yeah, apparently the onions are now directly connected to the Candy Pop buds, and in fact may be some type of life stage. There are also hints that these things absorb DNA from other life forms, possibly in an attempt to rapidly evolve. All possible doomsday scenarios aside, of course, I first separated the buds since they obviously lack many of the key onion traits. However, next I split the luminols from the onions, despite the luminols technically not being a part of any established family. However, considering their obvious similarities and parallels, such as spawning Pikmin via absorbing nutrients, and tendency to spawn where an onion will be located during the day, I think it's safe to assume that they are connected in some way. Finally, we split the onions and Flarlick, since they appear very similar and are able to directly interact, unlike the others. And now for the moment that you've been waiting for, the Pikmin family cladograms. 3 Piclopedias in, and we only just now get entries for all the main Pikmin colors. Even the Bulbmin get a minor mention in the Startle Spores. And with this new info, we can make more educated guesses as to how these things came to thus be. As such, here is my theory for their creation. To begin, at the bottom, we have the Glow Pikmin. Like the Luminols, they're not technically part of the Pikmin family, and both Olimar and the Rescue Corps question whether they can really be counted as the same thing. However, given the obvious similarities between them and the other Pikmin, as well as the Luminol Onion connections I mentioned before, I thought it fair to include them here, if not for completion's sake at least. The next split separates the parasitic Hermikmin from the rest, as there are 3 unique types. From there, we separate the Bulbmin, who seem to mainly parasitize living creatures, from the Rock and Ice Pikmin, who parasitize inanimate objects, stones and ice. The next main split divides the Purple and White Pikmin, as they are primarily found underground. While technically any Pikmin could be found underground, and Pikmin 4 reveals that they did indeed have an onion, being found underground is still a primary trait of theirs, especially since the onions aren't found until you complete these super secret Leaf Sage trials. Not to mention their onions didn't even exist in Pikmin 2. Finally, we separate the Winged Pikmin, as they have the most different appearance and biology, then the Blue Pikmin due to their amphibiousness, and finally the Reds and Yellows due to their elemental immunities. Admittedly, I just kinda winged it on these last 4, though interestingly, Olimar theorizes that the Winged Pikmin came into existence via an ancient onion absorbing a flying creature and integrating their DNA into ancient Winged Pikmin, thus letting them evolve. This possible DNA theory calls into question exactly how similar the Pikmin are to their ancestors, and what traits were possibly taken from other beings. Regardless, I feel pretty good about this tree. Seems about close to correct, honestly. With the Pikmin all done though, next I'll talk about some families with members returning from Pikmin 1. Firstly, there's the Sporovid family, introduced with the Puffstool but unnamed until Hey Pikmin. First, we sever the Aspergilla genus from the others, as its sole member, the Puffstalk from Hey Pikmin, looks very different and is entirely harmless. Then we split the Fungirussus genus from the Parasitus genus, separating the Puffstool from the Toxstool. There's also the Moldy Dwarf Bulborb and Moldy Slooch, who are both stated to not be new members of their species, but actually a normal Slooch and Dwarf Bulborb infected by the Toxstool spores. They have the same species as the Toxstool, with the additional tag of Hostess, and as described are growing into juvenile Toxstools, so I grouped them here. Additionally, I grouped Pikmin 1's Mushroom Pikmin with the Puffstool for similar reasons. While they don't have any Piclopedia info, or even got a mention in Pikmin 1's cast call, it can be assumed they serve a similar purpose of spreading the Puffstool spores and assisting with propagation. So, here they go. Next is a very interesting one, the Gulix family. While the Gulix itself didn't appear in Pikmin 4, we did get a new similar enemy called the Fulix. It's called a member of the Gulix family and greatly resembles the Gulix, so it's safe to assume that this family includes both creatures. Obviously, they also compose the one and only split, with their mononuclei and binuclei genera. And now a family that has produced glorious wonders and astounding horrors. The Mamuta family. As stated in Pikmin 1's casserole, and then backed up in Pikmin 4, the Smoky Prog is actually a deformed larval Mamuta, meaning that both creatures likely belong to the same family. That said, both of their families are officially named unknown, so I just made the Mamuta family and jammed both of them in there. I suppose it could also be debated whether the Smoky Prog counts as a separate genus, considering it's a malformed larva, but it does exhibit entirely different behavior from the Mamuta, complete with a radically different look and a noxious gloom that only it and one other being can produce. So yeah, I'm gonna call it different. Next up, two families I didn't mention in the last video that have existed since Pikmin 2. To start, the Groink family, consisting of the Gatling Groink and the Fireflinger Groink. Not much to say here as there are only two of these monsters, though both belong to unknown families like the Mamuta, so I just gave them their own family. Then there's the Wraith family, with the Water Wraith and the Plasm Wraith. Now, technically, these two don't have a confirmed connection to each other, let alone confirmed families, but they do look somewhat similar, with transparent liquid bodies and a tendency to chase things that enter its lair, as well as Olimar mentioning the Plasm Wraith being directly similar to the Water Wraith. Specifically calling out this similarity makes me feel that said similarity is in fact an intentional choice. I also like the ideas of these things being responsible for the crashing, though with the Gulix being in its own family, it does mean this thing likely isn't directly related to either Wraith, thus meaning it had been stalking Olimar since Pikmin 2, not 1. Also, isn't it insane that Pikmin 4 brought back both the Smoky Prog and the Water Wraith? That's so stupid and crazy and I love it. But okay, back on point. Wraith family. I think everyone can be okay with this. And finally, there is one more family to talk about. A made-up family to classify the last few creatures belonging to an unknown family. The Space Hound family, containing the Ancient Sirehound, Moss, and Ochi. Now I know what you're thinking. Ochi's not in the Piclopedia, you fake gamer wad. And while I will not argue that second point, I can say the game makes a solid argument that the Ancient Sirehound is a common ancestor to Moss and Ochi. Its cells are used to cure Ochi's leafified tail, which would indicate it and Ochi's DNA are nigh identical, as are Ochi and Moss. Combine this commonality between canine-esque creatures across multiple star systems with the Shepherd family history indicating that Shepherd's people and their dogs migrated from some other world, and we have the possibility of the spacemen from the Pikmin series and their dogs being long-distance descendants of humans and modern canines. Obviously, this opens up several other plot holes, like why would PNF 404 be in such good shape if millions of years have passed, as that would be how long it would take for humans to evolve into these little munchkins. But at this point, we're getting kinda far away from the initial point of this video. For now, just know that we have enough evidence for me to stick the ancient Sirehound, Moss, and Ochi into a singular family, even if Ochi isn't in the Piclopedia proper. Completion, you see. With all that having been said, it's time to revisit my master cladogram to see how it all fits together. I'm also going to leave a link in the description, which will take you to a higher quality version of it so you can properly view and criticize it. Let's start with the 5 phyla we talked about last time, beginning with the chordates. At the very bottom, we have the Squish Squirt family and the Polyocular Slug family, who I chose to classify as primitive chordates for a few different reasons. Firstly, there's the Sun Squish. Olimar's notes detail it as a protochordate, with a skeleton-like notochord as a juvenile, before growing into a mollusk-like creature with a highly exposed external stomach. I looked it up, and apparently protochordates are not real. It kept sending me towards hemichordates, which appear to be mainly worms, which the Sun Squish very clearly isn't. So it's safe to assume this is a fictional classification done to explain an especially weird thingy. Given its extremely rudimentary appearance and the aforementioned skeleton-like notochord though, which is a real thing chordates have apparently, I opted to include it here in a totally new class of extremely primitive creatures. Similarly, there's the bog swallow, which Olimar specifically calls out as a possible type of primeval creature. Primeval is a fancy term for prehistoric. I decided for this one to do some outside research based on its traits, namely its round mouth, semi-aquatic habitat, and cartilaginous skeleton. The closest I could find is the infraphylum Agnatha, the group that contains hagfish and lampreys. They also have round mouths, skeletons made of cartilage, and several extinct species dating back to the Cambrian period. However, none of the classes in the infraphylum I found matched any of its other traits, namely its 6 eyes, its muddy habitat, and of course, its ability to suck. As such, I opted to include it in its own branch, one tier higher than the Squish Squirt as it's clearly more evolutionary advanced, but still under the fishes due to its aforementioned primeval traits. Speaking of the fishes, the next addition is the Prickle Puff, belonging to the Aptinopterygii class, but in a different order than the Blino, specifically the same order that the real-world pufferfish belongs to. Then above them is the Amphibia class, with a new branch for the Amphibiland family, consisting of the Gildamandui and the Gildamander. They go in the Urodela order, the same as real-world salamanders. Above that is the Aves and Reptilia branch, with a handful of new stuff. Firstly and most simply is the Gourd Feather family, which while not outright stated to be a bird, does exhibit some bird-like traits, namely a beak, feathers, wings, and overall body shape that's very similar to the Makiwis. As such, I placed it in Aves, being in a unique order but still more closely related to Makiwis than Snavians. Then there's the Reptilia class with a very odd little inclusion, the Crusted Rumpup. Like the Maudad, I know a lot of others would label this as an arthropod, especially given its carapace and scorpion-like body shape. However, it having sharp fangs and not attacking with its tail makes me second-guess this assumption. Furthermore, Olimar says this thing can use the hair on its tail to detect electrostatic fields emitted by other creatures, to compensate for its bad eyesight. I looked into it, and no reptile can do that, obviously, but some snakes do have sensory pits that can be used to detect body heat from prey. Of course, they also don't have poor eyesight, so I suppose this one is entirely just a gut assumption. I apologize to all these zoologists in the audience tonight, but bro, these things look more like reptiles to me, okay? Especially when you compare them to the other insects in this franchise. Irregardless, next up is the Mamuta family, belonging to their own order. On the one hand, they could belong to a fictional order, given their bizarre appearance and traits, mainly the Mamuta's desire to cultivate flowers, seemingly because it just likes them, and the Smoky Prog's literally everything. They could also maybe belong to mammals, under the Monotreme order, given their somewhat mammalian appearance combined with them laying eggs. Both are fair choices, but I opted to give them their own order, as other than the egg-laying and hair, they don't really seem to resemble them, such as the bipedal nature, weird smashy hands that can flower Pikmin instantly, and again the smoky progs everything. Really, just that stupid prog muddies the water regarding these things' biology just so much. What happened to you? Anyway, the Mammalia class is last. Firstly, we add the Proboscidia order, which includes real-world elephants. Obviously, the Snootwhacker family is likely a relative of elephants, so here they are. Next is Rodentia, which is where I put the Sharpshell family. This is based on them being based on real-world porcupines, which, yes, they are classified as rodents, I found that kind of odd, as well as being stated to scrounge through trash for food, which certainly sounds like something rodents would do. I toyed with the idea of putting them with the even-toed ungulates, but they didn't really resemble them all that much. Moving up a bit, there's the Space Hounds, belonging to the Carnivora order, same as real-world dogs. And finally, at the very top are the grub dogs and bread bugs like before. However, we also have an additional class that exists above the mammalians, a fictional class that we use to categorize the groinks. I've seen a lot of people label them as highly evolved fish, and I can see where that comes from given the tail fins and body shape, but their bipedal stance, lack of association with water, and of course the goddamn cannon stockade, makes me think they're a unique class of creature. Now, whether they belong to chordates is rather debatable, or heck, if they belong to any existent phylum at all is debatable, though I do think their body shape looks more in line with the chordates than any other established phyla. Of course, exactly how much of them is biological and mechanical is unknown, so it could be argued these things aren't even animals at all. Maybe they are a related creature that formed a symbiotic relationship with machinery, like the man-at-legs. Or maybe they're fully mechanical creatures unrelated to animals at all. Really, I'm just curious what others have to say, so please tell me your opinions below. You're even free to call me a racial slur of your choice. I don't mind, it's still human interaction. Now, technically, Echinodermata comes next, but there's no major additions to speak of, so let's move to the Mollusca phylum. Granted, not much was changed, but Amma still talks about it. Firstly, the shellcake family is stated to be related to bivalves. However, given how different they are to bivalves, including the pearly clamp, I gave them their own class, closely related to bivalves. The only other notable addition is that the clamps now have an official family, the snare shell family, so I updated them accordingly. And now for the returning big boy, the arthropods. Firstly, the arachnids didn't see any major new additions, other than the crusted rumpup debatably, but silence! Next, the Malacostraca class is where we add the Crablips family. It's obviously a highly evolved crab, so I put it in the Decapoda group. However, it's also radically different from the other crabs, so it gets its own branch. Finally, there are two new families of insects, the Snow Swallow and Spring Jab families. The Snowflake Fluttertail I put in the Lepidoptera order, as it's related to moths. Its curly proboscis also best resembles the Nectaris dandelions, as the flutterbees do not have proboscises, so I made it more related to it. Finally, while the sheer flea could be considered a mandiblard, given its similar name and body type, it also has several notable differences. Namely, it has legs and a sharp proboscis very similar to that of the burrownets. As such, it's put in the Diptera order, which right in between the burrownets and mandiblards. Finally, there's the Cnidarians, of which there's no real new members. However, I did decide to add the Berserk Leech Hydro, a plant species the Leech Hydro possesses in Hey Pikmin, acting as the game's final boss. Obviously, this plant is not a real Cnidarian, and may better belong to the same group Pikmin and other plant-animal hybrids belong to. But we have no idea what plant species this thing is when not possessed, and also have no idea if it normally shares any traits with the other mobile plant monsters. So, just for completion, I decided to pair the host with its parasite. Now, for two new groups that we never talked about last time. Firstly, the all-new plant-animal-fungi hybrid phylum. In Pikmin 4, Olimar makes note of a class of creatures called Ambuloradices, which is used to define the plant-animal hybrids like Pikmin and creeping chrysanthemums. There's also Ambulofungi, the same thing but for fungi like the puffstools. I assume it's safe to assume that these classes belong to their own phylum, which I gave the awful fusion name of Plenimalte, with the classes being split apart, of course. The ambulofungi only contains the sporovids, so there they be. For the ambuloradices, we first have the quaggled Meyerclops. While it was never called an ambuloradices, I think labeling it as such is a pretty safe assumption, given the plant life growing all over it and ability to siphon nutrients with its giant legs, kinda like roots. Then we split the chrysanthemums into one order, and the three Pikmin-related families, pelletweeds, candy pops, and Pikmin, into another, as those three families all likely share common ancestors. Finally, there's one more thing to talk about, a new kingdom, the protists. Everything we've talked about so far belongs to the animal kingdom. However, these last couple I'm grouping in as the protist kingdom. Far as I can tell, a protist is any creature who is a eukaryote, a creature whose cells have a nucleus, but who also does not properly categorize as an animal, plant, or fungi. And I think that saying other is a very good way to describe what we have left to talk about. At the bottom of this thing, we have the Gulix family, which are the most basic, consisting of just a few cells in a body of water. Then there's the Bublimp, which is a similar cell in water, but has a face and legs. Next is the Honeywisp, which also has a simple, almost ethereal body shape, with what appears to be a single pinkish cell and the ability to fly while carrying eggs. And finally at the top is the Wraiths, who are more mobile globs of liquid with probably the most advanced methods of attack and defense, like using giant stone rollers or elemental plasmas. So yeah, basically these guys are the ones who didn't seem to be proper animals, and I didn't feel right properly categorizing them with any other creatures, so I just sorta plumped them all into their own group. And with that, we are officially entirely done. That's every single enemy in the entire franchise, all classified and sorted into one gigantic family tree. I have no doubts not everything here is correct, either objectively or subjectively, and there's probably dozens of ways you could hypothetically fit these things together. But you know what? This is an answer I feel good about, and I'm willing to let stand as my conclusive Pikmin cladogram. That said, I do still highly encourage people to make their own versions and share them around, and maybe we as a community can cobble together something that everyone everywhere can agree with. More importantly though, I just want to thank everyone for the ludicrous, absolutely insane support my first Pikmin Taxonomy video got. I could never have imagined that video would get anywhere close to as many views as it did, nor could I imagine so many people would actually enjoy watching it. So thank you all for supporting it, and I hope that this follow-up was even 1/10 as good as the last video. Will there be a part 3? Probably, but only if Pikmin 5 happens in our lifetime. I've said my piece on everything taxonomy related in this franchise, and I really don't have anything else to say. If I did, it would probably only be like a minute long, so I don't know, maybe I'll make a short out of it, if anything. That said, yeah, I'm probably just gonna wait for the next game and see if it has a Picklepedia, then we get a big proper sequel to this. That said, I should probably ask that you don't unsubscribe, but I mean, I'm not your mom, you can do whatever you want. I've got plenty of other videos in the pipeline though, so hopefully this wasn't just a one-time blunder that did really well, and hopefully I can make other really neat stuff. All that being said, thank you all again so much for watching once again, and I will see you all in the next video.